This is Dr. Brian Adnoff. Good evening to everybody. Welcome to our DFCR webinar on Brittney Griner's imprisonment in the context of cannabis prohibition in the US and Russia. We appreciate everybody taking the time to join us. We've got a lot of people obviously interested in this topic, and we've got a great panel. To those of you who are not familiar with Doctors for Cannabis Regulation, we serve as a global voice for physicians and other health professionals to advance the legalization and science-based regulation of cannabis. Through education and advocacy, we leverage the influence and expertise of the medical community to realize the legislative changes necessary to promote improved public health, social justice, and consumer protections. This webinar is part of our effort to encourage and support these changes, and I'm the president of DFCR. Today we are addressing a topic that not only addresses the individual trauma, Brittney Griner, considered one of the greatest female basketball players of all time, but that discussed how her arrest and imprisonment in Russia intersect with cannabis legalization, cannabis in sports, race, sexual identity, and public health. We have three superb panelists and myself to weigh in on these issues. Each panelist will speak for 15 minutes, which will be followed by a 25-minute Q&A. We will be muting all participants' microphones throughout the panel and Q&A, but we welcome you to post your questions to panelists real-time in the chat. Our moderator, Janelle Bechtel, will present your questions to the panelists during the Q&A. So let's get started. Our first speaker is Dr. Mikhail Kogan. Misha is an associate professor at George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences and director of the Integrative Medicine Track program at George Washington University School of Medicine. He was an early adopter of the Washington, D.C. Medical Cannabis Program and is author of Medical Marijuana, Dr. Kogan's Evidence-Based Guide to Health Benefits of Cannabis and CBT. He's board certified in internal medicine, geriatrics, palliative care, and integrative medicine, and is editor of the Integrative Geriatric Medicine Oxford University Press textbook. Born and raised in Russia, Dr. Kogan is knowledgeable about Russian political and judicial system. So go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Kogan.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Adnoff, DFCR, and esteemed panelists. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces, or names rather, in the participants. So hi, everybody who I know and don't know. I grew up in Russia, and I think that lets me, or allows me, to sort of put the spin on this situation, not just as at this point, medical cannabis expert, but also as someone who was growing up in Russia in the 70s and 80s. And I first immigrated to Israel in the early 90s, and then I came to the United States in 1995. In 80s, we had this kind of, I would say, a triggered knee-jerk reaction. If you hear a word cannabis, maybe everybody can mute themselves so we don't have. So in 80s, we had this knee-jerk reaction. When you hear the word cannabis, immediately you're kind of thinking of alcohol, drugs, prostitution, jail time, and early death. I mean, I'm not kidding. This is what we were brainwashed to think from a very early age. Word cannabis was not in the vocabulary back then. Russian language has several words for marijuana. All of them are highly negative, and there was no positive or even neutral word for that matter. And so, that brainwashing was only a part of lots of other lies that the communist regime was telling us. Of course, unfortunately, today, in many ways, Putin Russia is not any better, probably worse in many aspects. And one aspect is most important for this particular discussion, and that's the subject of race. In my experience, I'm Jewish. I was born into a Jewish family. My family never tried to hide that fact. And growing up, I had to face anti-Semitism, having significant trauma in early teens. I joined one of the most serious martial arts schools, mostly because I had it enough to being told in my face, "dirty Jew," and being attacked with fists. So I learned to defend myself manually that way, and probably put myself at risk, my life at risk multiple times. And in retrospect, I think I now think of a lot of the traumas that happened to me in a kind of suppressed way. And now, as a white, privileged, relatively well-off physician, I can kind of only imagine what Brittany is going through, and many other people with less quote-unquote privileged racial background, especially in Russia, but not only in Russia, in all other countries, including US, in any areas where cannabis is not universally approved for medical or recreational use. And personally, I can only say I'm going to stay strong in support of Ms. Greiner and other people, and who profiled and unjustly sanctioned because of their race, color, and sexual orientation. So now, as a physician in DC, literally just my office is 10-minute walk from White House. I work with a lot of patients on Medicare and Medicaid, and those who are less fortunate, and we even have nonprofit trying to provide care at no cost. And I really try to pay specific attention to those struggles, because in contrast to maybe some other people, I understand the costs and complexities of this in a certain way. And so I learned that the cannabis is a very powerful tool for many medical conditions, definitely for chronic pain, definitely for the problem that Brittany had, and for which she was prescribed the cannabis that was found on her. And that actually makes the whole situation, to me personally, a lot worse. I mean, I feel a lot more frustrated and sad about the fact that basically what she got was the maximum sentence. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute or two when I'll describe the legal aspect of the cannabis, hemp, and CBD. And so, I try to speak up about this topic in different venues, and speak my soul and truth here, because I feel saddened by the fact that the country I grew up in is so backward thinking. So let's talk a little bit about the actual legal status of CBD, THC, and cannabis-related substances in Russia. So cannabis in any amount of THC is strictly prohibited, with anything above 6 grams will automatically get a jail time. If the amount is 6 grams or less, most of the times person gets up to 2 weeks in prison, but even more commonly just a fine upwards of up to about 400,000 rubles, which is, it's not small. It's somewhere around $5,000 or $6,000, if I'm not mistaken, my conversion rate. Possession of large amounts, which is quote unquote over 6 grams, can end up with 1 to 3 years, and possession of exceptionally large amounts over 1 kilogram of a dry flower can end someone in up to 10 years in prison. And so basically that's the level that Brittney Griner was prosecuted at. The one cartridge that was found on her was called a hashish, and it was equated to a 1 kilogram of dried flower, which I'm not gonna, you can make your own judgment about that. And I'm not even going to describe the fact that she had a standard cartridge, and calling that hashish would not be appropriate in our language, but that's the Russian language. The story of industrial hemp is very different. In fact, Russia has been the largest European hemp producer starting midway 18th century. In fact, 80% of all the hemp in Europe was coming from Russia at that time. And it was the most profitable industry, ahead of metal, fur, and wood. And actually, that fact, Russian government is strictly hiding, because they don't want the world to know this. And the production of hemp gradually decreased, and in 20th century, it basically disappeared by mid-20th century. Obviously, this was partially or in main way linked to the marijuana prohibition. And in fact, Russia never made hemp explicitly legal until February 2020, when the new regulation number 101 stated very clearly, I'm just going to read this because it's easier for me. This is a translation that I found on one of the legal websites. The use of cannabis for industrial purposes is permitted, provided that, number one, the particular kind of cannabis is included in the state registry or plant variety, and number two, the content of THC in the cannabis does not exceed 0.1%, and number three, that cannabis seeds of the above or following reproductions are banned from using for seeding. And so the Russians law really do not provide any special rule regarding CBD itself, and it's actually not very clear. Although historically cases of pure CBD products found on people in Russia ended up almost 100% with a fine and not even any jail time. So, this leaves us with lots of questions, of course, about what happened in Brittney's case and why did she get a maximum punishment as if she carried the exceptionally large amount of cannabis. And we can basically start and end with just one point. Really, it didn't kind of matter what defense was going to state or the fact that she was using it for medical reason and that she had a medical card and she had small amount. I'm pretty sure that this came directly from the Putin's cabinet, the order for the what sentence she was to get, that Russian courts are highly corrupt. In fact, we used to have a joke back when I was growing up that if you end up in if you facing a cop, your only way out is a big wallet and nothing else. So you just have to basically bribe them and leave. In fact, I'd say about 50% of all interactions back when I was growing up were bribery based. You can't get anything done without bribing your way forward. Usually not with, back then it was not money, it was alcohol. But, this was years ago, so I don't know what the situation is currently. And, I want to speak sort of towards the end of my part about, one particular point. I think what Brittney represents for Russians, and probably for some proportion of Americans, is a kind of the most feared pool of people. She represents successful Black woman, raised in the hood, and we'll hear more about her growing up soon. Openly lesbian, identifying as she, but presents as masculine, and fully embracing her identity despite how difficult it must have been for her to coming out of closet and being who she is and not being afraid of it. And for Russian elite, this represents this kind of, this cannot be happening on our land. Like, this is just not cool. This is not, we're not going to let that happen. And so, I have no doubt in my mind that this is a purely political imprisonment. I don't even know what the future holds about exchange or whatnot. But her whole story reminds me of one of my old-time heroes. And actually, it so happened that this hero's day of passing happened yesterday, September 13th. Her name was Nora Baker, and also known as Noor Inayat Khan. She was a British resistance fighter. She was exactly the opposite physically from Brittney. She was a tiny, I think 5'1" lady of a very, very fine stature that literally decided that she will, despite her stature, be in British resistance. And she was sending the messages behind the Nazi lines to supply critical information back to British resistance. She got caught after many, many months of avoiding being caught only because somebody betrayed her, and Nazis tortured her and ended up executing her. And her last word was liberté, freedom. And so just the parallel that I'm drawing here is just like Brittney and Nazi regime despised people like Noor. And our job is to not being afraid and standing up and speaking against oppressions like this. And I'll end my part with a quote from my favorite poet. This is Rumi. And I think this summarizes of where we are and the fact that we have to go through this level of calamity to realize how terrible the personal discrimination against someone is. But you know, it's a deep words. I hope you understand them, and they speak to the fact that often for us to really come out of the trouble, we have to go into the trouble full ahead, suffer immense amount of pain, not just as individuals, but as a society. And so Rumi's poem goes like this: when school and mosque and minaret get torn down, then dervishes can begin their community. Not until faithfulness turns to betrayal and betrayal into trust can any human being become part of the truth. And to me, this sort of call for action is not to being afraid of trauma that we may experience because of our actions, not being afraid of consequences of doing what we're called to do, and really speak about injustices and speak in defense of people who we want to defend. And even if I'm ahead of time, which I don't think I am, I'm going to stop here and pass the baton back to Brion and whoever goes next.
Thank you so much, Misha. Appreciate it. Look forward to the questions that come your way. Our next speaker is Dr. Olga Obi. She is a board-certified emergency medicine physician that now practices in an endocannabinology and cannabinoid medicine physician. She's president of the Association for Cannabis Health Equity in Medicine, or AHEM. Dr. Olga works closely with other Black, Indigenous, and Latinx health professionals to incorporate health equity into the policy and regulatory framing of the cannabis industry. Is a founder of Maha Health. She educates professionals on the endocannabinoid and holistic health sciences. Dr. Olga.
Thank you. I'm going to try to share my screen. I just have a few slides. And make sure that centered there. Can everyone see that okay? Yeah?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes.
Awesome.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you, Brian. Thank you, DFCR. Thank you, Misha, for prefacing what I am about to let all of us embark on. I always like to make sure everyone understands that I am no holds barred. I feel this is important so that we can move forward. So everything that I'm saying is intentional. It is intended to make you feel something visceral. And I want you to understand the perspective that I want to share with you. Brittney Griner was quoted as saying, "But there was no intent. I didn't want to break the law." And I want to introduce you all to a perspective where that doesn't matter in our country. When you're a specific type of person, when you look a certain way, it does not matter. If you're human, if you tried, and Brittany represents that. I want to introduce you to a perspective of what she represents in our country, America, and why she would have inevitably been locked up, and why there would have been grins, subtle grins, for her prosecution, her successful prosecution. Who and what she represents to America is a big deal. I also want to introduce to you first, though, Brittney Griner, the person, and hopefully you'll see what I mean in the end of all of this. And keep in mind, I won't be able to go into depth of the history behind the real hatred against queer people in our country, against Black and African people in our country, and against anyone who visibly is non-white. I won't be able to go into that history, but I will be able to go into something. So let's see. Brittany was born in the 90s. She was actually born in 1990 on October 18th. She was born in Houston, Texas. And by the time she was 14 in high school, she was nearly 6 foot tall. By the time she was 16, so about 2 years later, she shot up to 6'8". So she was standing at 6'9" at the time she was arrested. Brittany went to Nimitz High School. So in Houston, that is a school that serves an area called the Houston Housing Authority. This is basically public housing. And if you don't understand what that means, those are lower income or economically disadvantaged areas. Nimitz High School was made up of approximately 42% Black or African American and 50% Hispanic. So about 93% or majority of the school was Black and Hispanic. 73% of those students were classified in 2018, 2019 as economically disadvantaged. Okay. And by the time Brittany was in high school, she revealed to everyone that she was lesbian. She also revealed that to her parents, and her father did not accept that gracefully. In fact, she was forced to live with her assistant coach for about 6 weeks in her senior year because he did not accept her lesbian proclaimed status. She also revealed that in high school and as a child, she was excessively bullied, mostly because of her height, but also because of her sexuality and because of just being different, visibly different. Brittney Griner was classified as bigger, stronger, and taller than most men. This is a big deal in the Black and African communities. Being bigger and taller than men as a woman is not cool. She wore a size 17 shoe, 17, 1-7. She had hands that were characterized as bigger than LeBron James's. You can see there, that's Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who's taller than her, but her hands are the same size. Brittany was classified or considered to be edgy and, quote, androgynous. Androgynous literally means sharing two genders. Now, she did not have two anatomical structures that would make her both male and female. She, in fact, was cis female and identified as such. She was considered edgy because of how she dressed. Now, I said she was 6'9", and I said she has a size 17 shoe. And I would argue, what is she supposed to wear? But Brittney Griner was still classified as edgy, which for most people is considered uncomfortable. She was self-proclaimed as very passionate about working with children in order to bring attention to the issue of bullying, which is oftentimes covert, particularly against LGBT people or queer people. Brittany was divorced. She has a set of twins, and she was ordered to pay child support after she divorced from her ex-wife. And finally, Brittany garnered quite a few endorsements, specifically endorsements that highlighted her lesbian status. Brittney Griner today is married. She chooses the pronouns she, her. She identifies as a cis female. She dresses as a traditional male, and she's married to another cis female. And finally, Brittany is self-made, successful, and a ball player, not just any ball player, a basketball player. She plays as a center, which is normally the tallest player on the team, and often a player that has a great deal of strength and body mass compared to the rest of their teammates. In the NBA, the center is typically someone who stands close to 7 foot tall. That's the men's NBA, and Brittany almost stands close to that height. She played for Phoenix and then for China and then eventually for Russia. She's very decorated, playing for the US Olympic team, winning multiple gold medals. And finally, as I mentioned before, she has earned many endorsement deals, including a special one from Nike, which this particular deal was the first one that they had given to an openly gay athlete. So, what does Bryner represent in America, and why would she have inevitably been locked up? Well, as we all know, overt racism against various ethnic and minority groups has existed in the United States since early colonial times. In America, for Black Americans and African Americans, perhaps since slavery. And since then, many of us, most of us African American, face severe restrictions on our political, social, and economic freedoms. This is considered or called systemic racism. Still, there's another form of racism that many Black American women face, which is called subtle or covert racism. This lingering legacy of bias still affects mostly Black women in the United States, and its disguised nature allows the perpetuation of plausible deniability, essentially gaslighting other Black and African American women when we are victimized. So overall, in other words, what am I trying to say? I guess the question is, Greiner is in prison because she broke the law, right? I mean, she had marijuana. She wasn't supposed to. Or is this just plausible deniability? Is Greiner actually in prison because she represents a self-made, successful, athletic, taller than other men, bigger than other men, androgynous, queer, cis woman who is Black in America? I would argue that's literally why she's in prison, and not because she broke the law. Never mind that the law needs to be questioned, but because of what she represents in America. And what Dr. Kogan revealed to us is that this essentially is what she represents in Russia also, someone who we can't wait to prosecute and to utilize and activate covert racism, systemic racism, or overt racism to make a point, to try to hush us up or whatever. And that's basically what I wanted to introduce to you all, that this is literally what I think we're dealing with and what we need to keep facing so that we can find some solutions.
Thank you, Dr. Ovid. That was quite moving and excellent. Again, I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions on your talk. Our third speaker is Isabel Kirschner. Ms. Kirschner is one of New York's premier criminal defense attorneys, and she's also a former assistant district attorney in Manhattan District Attorney's Office. She's represented individuals accused of various narcotic-related offenses in state and federal court for over 40 years. Ms. Kirschner is the person, if you are in New York State, who you want to call if you get in trouble. So, Isabel, please take it away.
Hi, good evening, everybody. You can actually call me if you're outside of New York State also, that would be okay as well. So I actually would like to discuss sort of the laws as they apply in the United States to marijuana and to marijuana prosecutions. The irony, of course, is that there's been this uproar about how Brittney Griner has been treated under these terrible laws and that she was charged with large-scale transportation of drugs and sentenced to 10 years. And however outrageous this sounds, the truth is, in the United States, you could be facing the same thing because we have laws at certain states in this country where marijuana or cannabis is treated in what we, I think, would all agree are shockingly long sentences. It is a very arbitrary enforcement and application of those laws. And it really goes very much state by state, but it is really shocking to the conscience when you go through sort of the statistics of who's getting prosecuted and how they're getting prosecuted for these kind of crimes. Let me say one thing, though. I think, and maybe Dr. Ogu would disagree with me on this. I think it is, and maybe Misha would disagree with me on this, but I think it's somewhat a little bit of tunnel vision to ignore the fact that Brittney Griner got arrested at a really bad time. I mean, this was the beginning of the Ukrainian war. It's the beginning of the sanctions against the Russian government. She is clearly being used as a pawn in a political game. And that's something that you just can't ignore that. I don't know what this would have looked like had there this breakdown in relationships between these two countries would have looked like, but there's no question that that's a big part of why she has been treated the way she is and why they're trying to use her as a tool to obtain the freedom of Russians in prison here, such as a Victor Bout, who is a world-class arms dealer and warmonger himself. So I don't think we can eliminate that as an element in how she's been treated. And I also think what's interesting here is that everybody has referred to her as a successful Black woman. The truth is, the reason why she's playing basketball in Russia is, yes, in the context of women who play basketball, she's successful and she's great and she's accomplished, but women basketball players don't make any money. And so the reason why she's not LeBron James, and she's not even a bad NBA player in terms of her compensation. Women who play for the WNBA just don't make any money. And that's why she's in Russia playing basketball. I'm sure that was not her first choice and not something she would want to do. But we have to also keep in mind that this is part of a larger system of grossly undercompensated women athletes, and that's where we are. So there certainly are other issues at play here of how she found herself in that position, and that don't have anything to do with marijuana. They have to do with much larger and different issues. So 19 states plus the District of Columbia and Guam have enacted measures for recreational marijuana. And the first states to do so for Bryner was Colorado and Washington, which passed measures some time ago that eliminated criminal implications for personal use. But there are plenty of states in the country that still hold marijuana, in 19 states where it has not been decriminalized, and where Americans continue to face criminal prosecution and incarceration for even minor possession offenses. One of the things, and I'll bring it up because Dr. Kogan and I talked about this the other day, and some people may not realize this, but there are federal rules, federal criminal rules in this country that apply in federal courts. And while small amounts of marijuana may be federally prohibited, and drugs may be federally prohibited, every state has their own criminal procedure law and their own criminal penal law. And so depending on where you are in this country, in both legal and practical terms, you're going to be subjected to the laws of those particular states. And not surprisingly, those laws are particularly draconian in certain states that you would expect they would be, like Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Idaho, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Wisconsin, Wyoming. There are people face significant penalties, South Carolina, Texas, Utah, all over the, other places, even Pennsylvania. But there are significant penalties that people can face under those state laws for the possession of a relatively minor amount of marijuana. And as is the case, prosecutors have enormous discretion in individual counties and districts on how they apply those laws. And if you go through these states, state by state, virtually every single state, you are far more likely to face prison time if you are Black and charged with these crimes than if you are white. And the other matter is that the usage of marijuana is actually greater among the white population, which faces fewer penalties and consequences in almost all these states. In Iowa, for example, it's punishable by up to 6 months in jail and a $1,000 fine for any amount of marijuana. And you are 7.3 times more likely, as a Black person is more than 17 times more likely to be arrested. And in Dubuque, a Black person is more than 13 times more likely to be arrested and 7.3 times more likely to do jail time. So, and it's not that different in lots of other states. So it is the application of ridiculous laws that really causes the enormous gap in the way people are treated. When it's a middle-class white kid who gets locked up with a joint, he or she is much less likely to be treated with jail and fines than a Black person. And it's not, we forget that in a lot of these places, particularly in small jurisdictions, imposing penalties in the forms of fines are things that have like lifelong consequences for people, because these fines can cause, even if there's not jail, but these fines can cause garnishment of wages, and there's penalties and there's interest, and they just perpetuate a sense of poverty and oppression in these areas in a way that's very, very hard to measure. But they have lifelong consequences. And as I know in my business, look, I live in New York. Marijuana is not a crime that's necessarily prosecuted here. The only time I've ever represented, and in New York State, we've just decriminalized it, but the only time I've ever represented anybody in a significant, other than a possession case where under New York law, there's almost a mandate that you get a first free shot at it. But I did a federal marijuana case where there was literally thousands and thousands and thousands of kilos. And the really reason that it was so serious was because there were a bunch of murders that went along with the possession and distribution of those thousands and thousands of kilos. But obviously on other places around the country, this is used as a tool to control the Black community, and it is racially based, and it is racially applied, and it has ginormous effects on people's lives forever. And there are collateral effects. There are deportation effects for people who are not citizens and who may never have been in the country that they're about to get deported to because they got caught with a small amount of marijuana and convicted of small amounts of either marijuana or cocaine or anything else for that matter. So there are just tremendous racial disparities. In the federal prisons, although not limited to cannabis, more than 8 in 10 people in federal prison are on drug offenses. And so it's just an enormous percentage of the population in our prisons. There is, in many places, there's a real interest in keeping drugs and marijuana illegal. Small towns around the United States rely on their prisons to be employers for their entire populations. So, there is great, and look, I've been doing this a long time. On a personal level, I'm really glad drugs are illegal. I've made a lot of money on drugs being illegal. But the truth of the matter is, this is a failed experiment. I mean, we have tried every which way to deal with, drug addiction, drug problems in this country. I have always viewed it as a health issue, a personal health issue. Human beings are one of the few animals that will knowingly do bad things to themselves. We eat too much, we drink too much, we drive too fast, we do stupid things. We're stupid animals. But continuing to imprison and to penalize people for doing things that are bad for them, it just doesn't make sense. And so the only rationale I can think of is that there's an interest in keeping these things illegal because it keeps lots of industries alive. And so our entire drug policy in this country, and I must admit, the policy with respect to marijuana is changing, probably because most states have recognized that they can make a huge amount of money in tax revenue by legalizing it. And so I remember the first time I went to a dispensary in California, and because the federal banking system won't allow credit card transfers and banking that result from marijuana, you have to pay for everything in cash. But it's 25% cash it's 25% sales tax. I mean, it's an enormous tax boon for whatever state is doing it. And you are really seeing a lot of states, certainly in the Northeast, and I'm guessing in other places, they're going to start decriminalizing recreational use of marijuana just because they're losing out on an enormous amount of tax revenue. And so, but you still have, you know, the other states like Alabama and Mississippi that seem to go out of their way to do things that undermine the benefit of their own population. We're probably not going to do it because, you know, they'd rather you have assault weapons than a joint. So there you go. That's something that's just sort of built into our criminal justice system. We have politicians who lack a backbone on a lot of different issues, but certainly are afraid to get up and say, okay, you know, this is stupid. We're spending millions and billions of dollars a year on prisons and on taking care of people in prisons or not taking care of people in prisons. And why don't we just legalize this stuff and move on? And you know, there's just not a huge constituency to do that on a national level, and so the states are sort of the ones that who are there. But marijuana does get prosecuted. Although there, you know, like other issues, there is still pretty much a pretty good large percentage of our population who supports the decriminalization of marijuana, and yet there are alternative means and reasons for keeping it illegal. And I don't know how long I am into this presentation, but I'm kind of done with it. So unless anybody else has any questions, I'm happy to answer them when we get to them.
Thank you very, very much, Isabel. Okay, it's my turn. Get the slides up. All right, I'll give myself a little introduction. I'm an addiction psychiatrist, president of DFCR. I'm a clinical professor at University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus, and I'm editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Drug and Alcohol Abuse. In 2018, I retired as Distinguished Professor of Drug and Alcohol Abuse at the University of Texas Southwestern in Dallas. My career in academic medicine has been in academic medicine, doing primarily neuroimaging research, and I published extensively in the biology and treatment of addiction. Since my so-called retirement, I focused on my true passion of advancing drug policy reform. Now, I'm going to be approaching this issue a little bit differently because I've been fascinated by, well, not only Greiner getting drug tested, but sports figures, people playing sports in high school or college, professionally getting drug tested. Everybody who wants a job tends to get drug tested. I imagine most of us probably have been drug tested at some point, just at work, the routine. So I was interested in looking at this in terms of what the sports and in occupations, and particularly in the Olympics that Bryner quite a star in. And so looking into this, there is a World Anti-Doping Agency that for the Olympics kind of it organizes all of what's going to be okay, what's not going to be okay. This started in '68. Modern day drug testing was first introduced in the '68 Olympic Games. In 1999, WADA it was established to promote and monitor the fight against doping in sports. Now, interestingly, WADA does not define doping, even though it's in their name. In the dictionary, doping is said to be the use of a substance, such as a steroid or erythropoietin, or a technique such as blood doping, doping to illegally improve athletic performance. But the criteria for what is prohibited list, and that term comes up a lot, prohibited list, it must just meet 2 of 3 criteria. One is potential to enhance performance or doping. 2, it represents actual or potential health risk to athletes. And 3, it violates the spirit of the sport. So things like ethics, fair play, fun and joy, teamwork, dedication, basically apple pie kind of stuff. It's very vague and very loose and describes a lot of different things. So in fact, to be on the prohibited list, it does not even need to meet number 1, enhancing performance. Now, one of the things that puzzled me about this agency is the logo. Why does it have 2, looks like giant footprints to me, as their logo? And let me change my screen a little bit. I looked it up. I couldn't figure it out. My wife couldn't figure it out. It comes from, it was refreshed in their brand in 2022. The square represents the rules and customs of the game and an equal sign that evokes fairness with the human touch. And on the right, I have their previous logo that actually looks very much the same except a change in color. So the WADA does not really have information about how they make their decisions. So in order to try and understand why cannabis is on their prohibited list, I found an article called Cannabis in Sport, Anti-Doping Perspective in Sports Medicine. It's 10 years old now. What is key about this article, the lead author was Marilyn Hutis, and she was, at the time, she was head of the Chemistry and Drug Metabolism Lab at the National Institutes of Drug Abuse. And she wrote it with 2 members of the World Anti-Doping Agency. Now, Dr. Hutis is a superstar in the cannabis field. She is a renowned and superb scientist in terms of exploring the preclinical science of cannabis. She's very well known. She's very highly respected, and she's very involved in this. So it's worth paying attention to what she wrote. So the 3 things that I was mentioning, why cannabis is illegal, is prohibited, is the first thing that they addressed was represents actual or potential health risks to athletes. And you all are familiar, I assume, with the things that are listed as downsides of cannabis. Like all drugs, all medications, it has adverse effects on coordination, movement, time estimation, can make you dizzy, disoriented, make you feel high or stoned. It can even induce panic and paranoia, exacerbate symptoms of schizophrenia. It can lead to dependence. This all gave me a kind of feeling, a reefer madness list of bad effects of cannabis. It didn't tell me a lot about why the Olympics would care. And particularly when you compare it to something like alcohol, we all know that it's certainly not as dangerous as alcohol, does not have the adverse effects. And yet alcohol was not chosen to be on the prohibited list. Second, does it enhance performance? Because that would put it on the prohibited list. Cannabis can increase vasodilation and bronchodilation, thus increasing oxygenation of the tissue. Hutis stated that it can improve vision for goalkeepers and muscle relaxation. That was not referenced. Cannabis can extinguish fear memories by interfering with learned aversive behaviors. This is one of the key reasons why cannabis has been touted as a treatment for PTSD, and many patients with PTSD say it's changed their lives. The concern expressed in this article was that athletes who experience traumatic events in their sports career could benefit from such an effect. So essentially what what they are proposing is that cannabis should not be allowed because we want athletes who have previously experienced trauma to not have to be going through that trauma or having adverse effects from that trauma while they're performing their sports, because that would give them a benefit over other athletes. That's stunning. Cannabis can relax people. It can induce euphoria, improve self-confidence, relieve the stress of competition, and it's a pain reliever, which is why Bryner was taking it. It can permit athletes to work through injuries and pain induced by training fatigue. That's an interesting perspective. So I was wondering, well, what about other drugs that decrease anxiety and depression? Would those be considered performance enhancing and be prohibited by WADA? Well, antidepressants, anxiolytics, antipsychotics, and anticonvulsants can improve mood and decrease anxiety, but these medications are not prohibited by WADA, including drugs like benzodiazepines, like Xanax. So you can pop a Xanax as you're about to go and play basketball in the Olympics, but that would not be prohibited. They do not test for benzodiazepines. What about other medications that serve as analgesics, like nonsteroidals? According to what I was just referring to by Judas, anything that decreases pain would be enhancing the enhancer of performance. Well, WADA does not prohibit the use of nonsteroidals because these agents are not performance enhancing, but are at best performance enabling. So presumably there's a distinction made, at least somewhere, between performance enabling and performance enhancing. And then there's the spirit of the sport. Hudis says that the consumption of cannabis and other illegal drugs contradicts fundamental aspects of the spirit of sport criteria. The anti-doping community believes that the role model athletes in modern society is intrinsically incompatible with the use or abuse of cannabis. Has anyone in this community ever talked to a snowboarder? Furthermore, they go on to say, although some anti-doping officials propose also banning cannabis for out-of-competition testing, this appeared beyond the anti-doping mandate, and it was believed to violate athletes' privacies. For these reasons, cannabis use is prohibited only in competition. So you can use when you're not in competition, but you can't use when you are in competition. So I'm left with, and I think anyone reading this article, again, written by a stellar scientist, is cannabis a performance enhancer or does it impair performance? If decreasing anxiety, stress, and pain in athletes by cannabis is considered performance enhancing, then why aren't antidepressants, anxiolytics, and anxiogenics allowed? Why is it so important, presumably to WADA, to assure that our Olympic athletes are stressed, anxious, traumatized, and in pain? And if use of cannabis violates the spirit of sport criteria due to role model athletes in modern society, why is cannabis prohibited only in competition? And in terms of the spirit of the sport, fair play, U.S. sprinter Sha'Carri Richardson, she tested positive for THC in the summer of 2021. And because of this, landed up being unable to participate in the 2022 Olympics. Russian skater Kamila Valieva, she tested positive for trimethoxazine, a drug that boosts athletes' endurance and blood. She tested positive at the end of December 2021, but it was not revealed until 2022 Olympics. She was allowed to compete. I don't want to jump to, I will jump to some conclusions here. Looking at the two pictures, one might make some assumption about one of them, Richardson, was not allowed to compete. The other one was, despite the spirit of fair play. Unfortunately, this is breaking news. At least according to the Wall Street Journal, cannabis is set to stay on the World Anti-Doping Agency prohibited list as of a couple days ago. So let's jump to occupational, because it's really not that much difference to what we've just been talking about in sports. Why are people tested for cannabis use in the workplace? Presumably it's because of workplace safety. Even though a positive cannabis test does not identify impairment, studies have shown that it does not have a meaningful impact on job injury accident rates. And the National Academies of Science and Engineering and Medicine, they say that there is no sufficient evidence to support or refute a statistical association between cannabis use and occupational accidents or injuries. Again, I want to point to the elephant in the room in terms of alcohol. Just like in the Olympics, if we're concerned about a drug being dangerous, then why isn't alcohol being tested for in the occupational field, in the sports field? It's far more likely to cause injury than cannabis is. And then there are a whole slew of other medications that people take over the counter that also increase accident rates. And the most common way to look at this is medications associated with accidents in driving. And there's a whole list of medications that increase accident rates just as much, if not more, than cannabis does. So why do we really test in the workplace? It's because of the Drug-Free Workplace Act of 1998, implemented as part of the drug war. And it came from Reagan era. And the idea was to make it illegal to manufacture, distribute, dispense, or have in possession prohibited controlled substances. It was to stop substance use generally. It had nothing to do with safety in the workplace. So what do all these things have in common that we've been talking about in terms of cannabis? Why is Bryner incarcerated in Russia? Why are particularly Black Olympic athletes not being allowed to compete? Why is WADA putting cannabis on the prohibited list? This is anti-science. There is no science to support it. It's not in the interest of public health. It's not in the interest of, that there's no rationale from a medical perspective. It's part of a 100-year effort to demonize and racialize cannabis. So I will end my talk there and let us go to the discussion.
Thank you, Brian. Hi, everyone. So I do have a couple of questions, but just a quick reminder, if you have a question, please type it in the chat and then I will read it and Brian will direct it to probably the most appropriate person to answer. And for some of them, probably everyone will answer. So again, if you have a question, just drop it in the chat and we will definitely get to it. We have 2 or 3 so far. So the first question is, how can we, those who support Brittney Griner being released, play our part to help bring her home? And so, Brian, I would assume this is a good question for the group.
Yes.
Well, why don't we go in the order of the presenters? So Dr. Kogan, if you have a response to this, and let me know if you need me to repeat the question.
Yeah, you know, I had a pretty significant change in hearts in the beginning. I actually literally tried to be part of her legal team, and I contacted the lawyers, and I'm not going to go into details of what happened there, but I did provide them a lot of information, and I realized this was total waste of my time and their time. The case had nothing to do with anything around what I was offering. It just is completely irrelevant. So I kind of, after that, I realized, forget it. The only thing I feel strongly to do is just to speak up and saying that this is political incarceration that had nothing to do with any legal situation in Russia in terms of cannabis law. And, you know, what Olga highlighted the most, I mean, it's the feared person, and they used her as a political pawn in a war against Ukraine and the rest of the world. And, you know, I can say it openly, and I know that probably that means that my kids will potentially, at least until while Putin is there, will never go and see their parents' motherland. My wife is also Russian. But I'm going to keep speaking up against it, because I feel like if I don't say a word, then that means that they're allowing their regime to suppress me too. And I had enough of that shit when I was growing up. You know, and I can sort of I can feel the frustration of someone who's walking along the street and being feared every time the police car passes by. You know, and all I can say, I can commit to say that's screwed up, and and it's not gonna be what I like, the world I like to live in, and then do my individual work. I'm actually, at my heart, because I grew up in Russia, I'm completely apolitical. I hate going to rallies. I hate speaking, just because it was bitten out of me in a heavy way. And I think I have to find my truth to get back in that game and say, yup, I can't just stay quiet, you know, at this point in my life. But I don't think I'm quite there yet. I think I need more time.
Thank you so much for sharing. And someone said in the chat, thank you for your candor and transparency, because it's a journey for each of us. Dr. Olga, do you want me to repeat the question?
No, thanks, Janelle. I think it's important to understand how much power we do have at keeping things alive. And so if we're interested in freeing Brittney Griner, which I think is, you know, one thing, but the other thing is just like a song or just like a genre, just like an idea, instead of it just being a trend, be serious. Let's just keep talking about it for sure, but keep talking about what it represents, what we're actually talking about. Have those conversations with people that you normally wouldn't, who are open to having those conversations. I spoke with Isabel a few days ago, and she really challenged a lot of things that are inside of me that would have otherwise stayed silent. And so, you know, what we're talking about is an assault against logic. It's an assault against people, like Dr. Rachel brought up, and that's what we're talking about. So keep talking about it. Keep talking about it. Keep talking about it until it becomes a part of our normal conversation. And then I think things can move from there. But otherwise, if it just stays covert and subtle and silent, or unspecific, non-specific, then nothing will change.
Thank you so much. Isabel, not sure, particularly from the legal world, if you have any advice for those of us who'd like to do work. Oh, you're on mute. Just need to unmute.
For focusing specifically on Brittney Griner, I mean, I believe this is a strictly political. This is a political tool, and as I said before, she could not have gotten arrested at a worse time. So, root for Ukraine and hope that there's a coup in Moscow, you know, and hopefully that will that will work to have the Ukrainians decide that they need to repay some of their debts to us, and hopefully all the Americans that are being held in Russia can get home. we have work to do here. And yes, what's happened to her is terrible, but we have plenty of work to do in this country. And I think the one thing that, and this is strictly from a political perspective, because unlike Misha, I am very political. I love going to rallies. I love cursing at my enemies. It makes me really happy to get in the face of people who disagree with me. You know, what we have learned, I think, from the progressive side of things is that we have neglected how important state level and local level politics are. And that is what has happened in this country is the progressives have been happy to have the White House, but they've forgotten how important it is that the state houses are equally attended to in terms of getting power in those places, because that's really where the change comes. The federal level, you know, it's going to be a broader, bigger question, but really the state level is where the change is going to happen in places. So this is just one example of that.
That's great. Dr. Brian, do you have any insight for us to do work to help to get Brittney Griner released?
Well, I think my comment is to thank whoever asked it, because it really highlights an issue that we struggled with in putting together this panel. And that one, there's been criticism from people supportive of Greiner that her issue is being used by people on both, you know, with multiple different perspectives to use for their case. And we are in some ways doing that because it's so relevant. Her arrest and the issue of cannabis is so relevant to what DFCR stands for and what we advocate for. But on the other hand, we don't want to lose the person that Dr. Kogan was talking about, the person of Brittney Griner, the person who is suffering in prison, really for nothing she's really done. It's because of politics. And I agree that this is politics. Getting her out is politics, and they will only politicians respond to noise, and I think the attention she has gotten is only because of the noise that's been made and the pressure that's been put on the politicians. Isabel is coming about it's, you know, politics is local, and yes, Dr. Oga said politicians respond to noise, and so I would make noise with your local politicians as well as your national politicians.
Thank you all. We have 2 other questions so far. So this, I think we'll just continue in the same style since we do have some time here. The second question is, do you all think that if LeBron James was in Brittney Griner's position, that he would still be imprisoned? Why or why not? And we can just go ahead, Dr. Kogan.
He wouldn't be in this position, period. I don't think so. He wouldn't be, because that would be the level of political uproar that they wouldn't tolerate out there. And, you know, I have no doubt, I think I wrote that in the chat, I have no doubt that she was picked for all the reasons that Olga and to some degree Brian and I were mentioning. It's all a purely political pickup. You know, if he would end up for whatever reason, maybe, let's say that he would have picked up for a good reason, right? That he would have been picked up with a kilo of flour. He would have probably been freed after a big fine and a week of, you know, it would have been a totally different scenario. You know, I think just basically that's it. I don't believe that there's any other clear reason to not only give her this sentence, but to actually even show the world the process.
Thank you. Dr. Oga, thoughts?
Yeah, you have to forgive me. I'm not sure if he's still playing. I don't think he would be, but if he's not still playing, he'd still be in prison. And he's, I just don't have that much faith that we care about people that are Black like that, regardless of what they do, with the exception if he was still an active NBA athlete. I think then that industry has enough political power that he might, get out, depending on how close he was to retirement and what he was worth to them financially and his value to them. But as a person, if he weren't playing, if he's not playing now, he would still be in prison for sure. And we might not even be talking about it. We might be talking about something else. That's how I feel.
Isabel?
I don't know, and I was going to ask Misha. I mean, if LeBron James, the superstar, got locked up with a little bit of pot at the beginning of the Ukrainian invasion, I mean, don't you think he'd be even a bigger prize for the Russians?
It has nothing to do with price. They don't care about price. You guys completely misreading everything. It has nothing to do. The exchange, if it's going to occur, going to have a completely different reasoning. Russia they're not asking for money. They want to show
they're asking
the world.
For Victor Boot.
They were showing the world there is a Tsar, and the Tsar make decision, and the go hell the rest of the world. That is what Russia is. And they would have never arrested him for one particular reason. They like him. They would like him because color alone here probably wouldn't be big of a deal. If he was a stellar player, Russians actually like basketball. They like soccer, they like hockey. And he would not be a threat for them. He would actually be part of the good politics. He would not be arrested. And that's my opinion. I mean, Olga, I hear you. I hear you coming to this from a little different perspective, not knowing internal culture. I speak about this just for that. I think, frankly, he would have way higher chances of getting arrested in the U.S. if I to put frank opinion. That's my opinion. And it's not about price. They don't necessarily want to exchange anybody for anybody. I mean, that's a secondary or shadows of some other political games they're playing. But their main politics is, look, we can do whatever the hell you want, and no one can tell us anything. That's really the way the law operates out there.
But wouldn't they be making a bigger statement of that if they took this worldwide superstar and said, we're going to do whatever we want with this worldwide superstar?
But they're not trying to make a big statement about pot.
Oh, no, I'm talking about pot, just about being able to control somebody who's rich and powerful in their lives. I don't think anything has to do with pot.
They like who they like and they don't like who they don't like. I don't know. Maybe in that sense you're right, and I'm not in disagreement. I'm speaking strictly from the arrest itself. In my opinion, was a throw to the world saying we're going to do this to this category of people because we don't believe they should be at any power, any success level. And the other underneath of that, yes, it couldn't have happened at the worst timing. And for that same reason, what would be the chances of some significant businessman being like, I don't know, Elon Musk being arrested in Moscow for a pot? And we do know he smokes, right? I mean, that's
one can only hope.
Right. So like, I don't know. I don't think that they would have done it because they would not want to have that level of problems on their hands, because it obviously would have been a lot more problematic. And believe me, Putin is not stupid. No matter how people want him to be sick or whatnot, he's not sick and he's not stupid. They played this game very carefully, and I'm absolutely sure that they picked her because they knew that the voices of uproar will not be there, that it will send
within Russia
and within the international community, that the voices will not be loud enough. A couple of months ago, when this is all was at the peak, I remember I was reading Facebook post by somebody saying, oh, before she traveled there, we didn't even know who she was. And I was like, oh, wow, it actually is true. And what does it tell us about women basketball in this country? That's, I think, what this is about. They picked this for a very particular reason, because they picked the person that they represents the most hated category. That is my take on this. And they did this to show the rest of the world, screw your democracy. That's it. We are Tsar's country. We will do this. And maybe they will try to do something to exchange her for somebody really important to them. That could definitely come. And could have picked somebody else maybe for that. But trust me, that's probably a secondary issue, not primary.
Wow.
Somebody's asked me direct message. Can I answer that? Because it says, are the racial issues in Russia serious? They're in your face. They will come to your face and they'll hit you in the face and say, oh, you're whatever. We don't like you. Hit in the face. And the police will not stop that in any situation. It's a little different. Here, racial issues are profiled in a certain hidden, quote unquote, way that comes to the surface when something awful happens. But it happens in every day. And it's usually behind most of our backs, right? In Russia, it's wide open. And it's not coupled, and it's a very large proportion of population. It's a very uniform population. There are very little minorities in Russia overall. It's a much more uniform population. Here, a lot of the larger areas, we're living together. There is no living together in Russia. It's all white, and I can only imagine. Like 20 years ago, I remember how I had one friend who was from Georgia, which is a country in the former Soviet Union, who was very dark. And I remember we had some conversation. He was like, you never walk around safe. And not because like police, but because somebody can just come next to you, like, and just say, oh, we don't like you, and hit you in the face with a bat. And police will not do anything. Police would not do it. But anybody else would. So yes, Russian issue in Russia just as serious, in some ways more serious than the US.
Thank you so much for that insight. We have another question. Before I ask it, I will just also add in here, my aunt is actually one of the first Black women to professionalize the sport of basketball in the United States back in the 70s, before there was the WNBA. And I can tell you that the pay margin is the same today as it was then. And she holds a very similar profile to Brittney Griner, being a lesbian, presenting the way that she does. It is incredibly disheartening to see, and also working 2 jobs, playing overseas while being in an American league to make ends meet. And so I just wanted to add that in there, that this long arc in women's basketball, it's incredibly disheartening to see. So thank you all for highlighting that. So the third question is, do any of the panelists think that talking too much about this case could potentially hurt the chances of Brittney Griner being traded for the Russian prisoner? Big question.
I think initially that was what I understand, and others may know more about it. But initially, the word from the White House administration was let us work on this and keep it on the down low and just keep quiet, and we're taking care of it. And then when nothing happened, that's when people started talking about it, because nothing was happening. So the feeling was that unless we do say something and unless there is noise, nothing is going to happen.
Do any of the other panelists want to try to take this question as well? Do we think that? Oh, go ahead. I was going to repeat it, but if you remember it.
And then maybe, it's hard to, I can just say I haven't been alive that long, I haven't been alive for the entire time that everyone that came before me has been dealing with this racism and anti-humanism. But I can say that it feels like it's being quiet is over. We've tried that already. This is what is coming out. We've already tried this many times. Many of us have lost people, lost our dignity, raped, lost our jobs. I mean, I think it's probably time to stop. I think that's what the expectation is that someone is going to come and save us if we just wait and stay quiet. And I don't think that works. I don't think it's working. I don't think it works. I don't think it's ever going to work. And so that's my instinct, is to say that. Now, again, I could just be naive. But my instinct is that what hurts is silence. That's what I think.
I can't agree more. I mean, I think with our tools and a modern understanding of the consequences of trauma and dozens, if not hundreds, of tools of addressing it, I think we have to lay it out there. And I don't believe that the current administration is really going to try to do things aggressive. I think they're scared. I think they're scared that nothing they will do any good. And they're scared of Putin's nuclear arsenal. I mean, everybody should be. We were, I don't know if anybody here was alive or was significantly adult in 60s to realize how close we came to the nuclear war. And I mean, this Putin is, I think he's healthy, but he's psychologically is potentially not very stable in a certain way, and who knows? The history teaches us that tyrannical regimes like this, you always think that you reach the bottom, and then there is always deeper to go down until that regime is over. And so I don't know. I'm fearful, but it doesn't stop me from speaking up at this point, because I'm totally with you. Enough silence.
Wow.
I think there's strategic ways, though, of talking about it. Because just the emotional approach is not. I don't think that's the best way either. I think there's strategies in talking about it and not staying silent. And I think that's yet to be explored. But I do think there are strategies.
And I think, unfortunately, strategies in Russia are way more difficult to understand, because they're never directly through the legal system. They're always bribing and things getting done around the legal system. And I'm definitely cannot speak to pragmatic approaches, because I haven't lived there in decades. I'm so disconnected, and even I still have graves of my grandparents and tons of friends. I spoke with my cousin on the weekend, and we were talking about mundane things, and I'm sitting there and I was waiting for her to start talking about the war. She never said a word. And when I asked her, she said, "Oh, what war? We're fine." And I'm like, oh my God. So I decided to not spill beans in her face, because I felt like they're cocooning themselves, and it's getting worse out there. They're suffering. The prices for basic commodity went up from 5 to 10 times in the last 6 months. So everything is going to go downhill for them. They're protecting themselves, and their system is so non-linear. For us who live in America, we know how to do things legally, right? I mean, we believe that our law and our democracy is true, that's why I live here, right? I'm not going to ever try to understand how you get things done over there. We can only do things where we are. Our control area is this, right? And that's what we should do, with hopes that the rest of the control somehow will spill over to that area, and that something will change. But I mean, I don't know practically right now what we can do to help her. I really don't. I feel like being vocal and loud goes so far because our administration is not doing enough. And we can be careful how we speak. I think Brianna is totally right. Both sides of the aisle are using her case for political reasoning, which is painful to watch. But I wish I'd have an answer to how to block this.
Wanted to end with addressing that from a more global perspective. You're right. All we can do is change things here. But coming back to the cannabis aspect of it and the drug war aspect, so much of the drug war internationally was started by the United States. And much of the world was pushed into the draconian laws that they have because of the United States pushing on this over a period of many decades. We have a lot of power here in a lot of areas, militarily, economically, politically. And that is why, I don't know about Russia per se, but that is why so much of the world has these draconian drug laws. So making the changes here is certainly a way to start and get it changed elsewhere around the world. So our time is up. I want to thank everybody. I want to thank the panelists, Dr. Olga, Isabel, Misha, Lisa behind the scenes, Janelle administratively. And thank you all for being here. We'll have this available on YouTube soon. And please remember that we would appreciate any donations that allow us to put on programs such as this. This is new for us, having a panel, and I'm very proud we could do it, but we can only do it with your support. Everybody have a good night.